thank you for your very warm welcome and for Alan's kind words. I've been to the North East, I think, 4 or 5 times in the last 18 months, which is a measure of your importance and the expectations we have of you. And I think I'd just like to say, acknowledge what you've achieved in this region, because it's often overlooked nationally. The party has had a very strong base in the southwest of England, in the Highlands of Scotland, more recently in London. But when I was reflecting, the strengths of the North East have often been diminished, and I think we should acknowledge them more openly. I mean, starting with my colleague here, who was the first really to make a breakthrough at a parliamentary level, and has taught us some very powerful lessons. He was very kind about my own role in Parliament, but Alan is a figure we all respect. There's a line in Kipling about people who keep their heads when all around are losing theirs. And that sort of calmness and authority and reluctance to panic and just calm everybody down is a very powerful asset which Alan has brought to our party in recent years. And also an inspiration about how you actually hold your seats. I mean, there's a lot of MPs who are now worrying, holding on to very marginal seats, but Alan has shown how you do it, in the bad times as well as the good times. And it's identification with your own grassroots and working there, and being very much the champion of your area, and he should be, and indeed is, an inspiration to all of us. But it isn't just Alan. I mean, your achievements in local government, we often now trip off the tongue, is it 7 out of 10 English and Welsh cities that the Lib Dems control? But Newcastle is always the one we list first, because of what you've done. And I know you're going to follow that up in Gateshead next year, I'm told, that's very much on the cards. And we're going to get breakthroughs elsewhere at a parliamentary level in Durham, in Newcastle. I believe Redcar's now on the radar screen. There are all kind of other potentials, and of course the County Council in Northumberland. So, a lot has been done, a lot to look up to and respect and to support, which is why I'm here. I think it's also useful from the southern perspective to occasionally take a check on the mood in different parts of the country. Just to make 2 obvious points, I've been arguing with my colleagues in London over the last week about mansion taxes, and I have London colleagues, and I say to them, well, millionaires are quite rich people, aren't they? And they say, well, $1 million, what's that? It's just a snip. I suspect that isn't heard very often in Newcastle and Gateshead. I don't know, maybe other ones, but I suspect the values are a bit different. And similarly, and rather importantly, and I'll come to that in a minute, we are facing potentially a very big attack on government spending, probably the big issue of the next 5 years. And I know that this is a region that probably more than any other depends on the government and the state in sustaining the local economy. And how we balance those things are going to be very difficult, and I look to you for advice, actually, on how we best get that balance right. But let me just start a little bit by talking about where we are on the economic issues, because it's the economy that will almost certainly dominate the coming election. When I was at party conference, I used an image which some of you will have heard, and I apologise for that, but I think it's a durable one. I think it makes sense. That essentially what's happened is that the British economy has had a massive heart attack. We've had ups and downs in the post-war period. If you like those to attacks of flu, you have a temperature, you get worried, goes down, back to normal. But what's happened in the last year is something much more profound and much more long-lasting in its impacts. What's happened positively is that the patient hasn't died. It's in an intensive care unit. To be fair to the government, they broadly got it right when the emergency happened. They did the right things. Certainly for a month, they had a purple passage. Did some very important things. We had interest rates cut to virtually 0. The idea of creating credit artificially, the quantitative easing, massive budget deficits, the nationalisation and rescue of the banking system, a massive devaluation. These have all played their part in keeping the patient alive. But it is just alive. I mean, we're not talking about recovery in the normal sense. We're talking about a patient that is still attached to all kind of life support systems, which are going to have to be gradually withdrawn over the next few years, and it's going to be difficult. And as with any other major attack, there are going to be some very big and difficult legacies, which we're going to be struggling with in years to come. One of them is unemployment. I mean, I was very struck this week that in all the debate that's going on in London about the booming bonuses of Goldman Sachs and the rest of them, it coincided with an announcement that we've had another big leap in unemployment. And it may not be as extreme as was feared 6 months ago, but unemployment is almost certainly going to increase over the next year. You will almost certainly be fighting a general and local election next year against the background of unemployment at a level we haven't seen for a couple of decades, perhaps worse, where across the country we are probably in a position of having 1 in 5 young people out of work. Again, I don't know what it's like here, but in my relatively prosperous bit of southwest London, when I go to university campuses, they tell me that 1 out of every 2 graduates hasn't got a job. You know, they're doubling up as interns, they're going on to master's courses, and they're hiding unemployment. But it is absolutely profound. And for 16 to 17-year-olds growing up on the States, there is no work and no prospect of work. And this is a very real challenge, and we have to have positive answers to it. So one of the legacies is unemployment. The second legacy is a broken banking system. I mean, you know, when you try to get your head around what happened over the last year, I know we can go back to Northern Rock and all that, but the crucial crisis was last October, when the British banking system was, we now discover, literally within 24 hours of total collapse. They were monitoring the ATM machines of the key banks in the night before the banks were effectively taken over. I mean, it was close to complete collapse. And we have this extraordinary phenomenon of this extraordinarily sophisticated banking system with very clever people paid staggering amounts of money just collapsing like a pack of cards. But it has been rescued, and it was right that it should be, but there is now a legacy because those banks are not performing well, they're not performing sensibly, they're still not lending to companies who need credit to survive. Again, I don't know what your local problems are in that respect, but I'm getting a steady stream of businesses coming to my constituency surgery every Friday night. You know, sometimes sophisticated IT companies, sometimes just local shopkeepers, and they tell me the same story over and over again. They go to Barclays, they go to RBS, they go to HSBC, and they can't get their credit renewed, or they're charged some astronomical arrangement fee, or they get demands for personal security. And a lot of them are just closing their doors. Now, I mean, even amidst this talk of recovery, they're closing their doors and they're laying people off. And the banking system hasn't been sorted. And my main criticism of the government is that although they did the right thing last autumn, you know, they should get credit for that, they have subsequently not followed it through. And the banks that you rescued with your money are still not acting in the national interest. They've lurched from recklessness to extreme conservatism, hoarding capitals. It doesn't entirely their fault, it's partly the regulators' fault. And the money is not flowing out to business, and indeed personal borrowers too. And a government in which we had a key influence would target that as the absolute top priority. And beyond that, you know, we've got to make sure this doesn't happen again. I mean, we've seen an economy almost destroyed by the excesses of the banking system. And it's got to be fundamentally reformed. But I spend 2 or 3 days a week going down doing conferences and meetings in the City of London. And they've persuaded themselves that it's all over. You know, we're back to normal, back to bonuses, back to the old ways of doing things. Nothing's ever going to happen. We can just continue as it were before. And that cannot be allowed to happen. The banking system has got to be fundamentally changed so that we have relatively simple banks, and Northern Rock's a good example, of relatively simple banks doing very basic things, you know, taking deposits, lending to households, lending to businesses, protected by the government, guaranteed by the government, and regulated by the government. And if some of the banks want to go off and be what the Government Bank of England calls casinos or hedge funds, then they go off and do it, but they don't hold the rest of the economy to ransom. They're not underwritten by the taxpayers. They lose their money, that's their problem. And to make sure that happens, the banking system is going to have to be radically reformed, because some of the big banks have these two aspects interconnected in a very, very dangerous way. And the government is currently afraid to tackle them and take them on. And that has really got to happen. So we've got the problems with the banking system. And then the third of the big legacies is to do with the budget. And this is where we get into difficult political territory. Because the British government, well, like the Americans, but the British government are in a uniquely bad position, have run up enormous deficits as a result of this crisis. I mean, essentially what's happened is that the government, rather than the public, has borne the costs of this recession. I mean, there will be people in this room who have been hurt by unemployment or because they had money in a bank deposit that isn't earning any interest. Individuals have been hurt, but most of the pain has been absorbed by the state, by the government, in taking less revenue. Essentially what's happened is that government tax revenue has completely collapsed. The share of taxation in the British economy is now lower than at any time since Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister. I mean, I remember Harold Macmillan, and a lot of you will. But we're back there. It's about 35% of GDP. All the money that used to come in from the City of London, from the housing bubble, that's all gone. And it's probably gone for quite a long time. So tax revenue has collapsed, and public spending has kept rising. And actually rightly. It was right that public spending kept rising. It's one area where we agree with the government and we fundamentally disagree with the Tories. It was right that the government kept the economy going, helps people who are out of work, absolutely right. But the consequence of having 35% of GDP in tax, and now something like 50% in the form of government spending, is that the difference is 13, 14, 15, and that's what governments have to borrow. And we all know that isn't sustainable. It's okay at the moment, they can borrow very cheaply. The market's in a very unusual situation. But within a year or so, this cannot continue. There will have to be something fairly radical to turn this situation around. And that's where we get into the area of whether we concentrate on taxes or public spending. I've taken the view, Nick Clegg has supported, that we have to be honest with people about the nature of the problem. And you can try and pretend it doesn't exist. You know, we could say that because the Tories say the world is round, we should insist it's flat, but actually, you know, it is round, there is a problem, and we've got to confront it and be open about it. And we've tried to get out in front and be honest about the scale of the problem and identifying areas where we think the state will have to be cut back in a way that maintains a basic sense of fairness and using government expenditure in the right kind of way. And it is controversial, but those of you who are running councils will know perfectly well, you've got to do this every year anyway. You've got tough budgets, you've got to deal with it. And that's the position we're now at a national level. But I would welcome feedback from you on how you think we should deal with this. What I think we have to do as a party, because it's one thing simply to go out in front and say, let's be honest about the problem, we have to give people a sense of hope, something positive. And that's where our key messages will be at the next general election. I think one of the key positive messages is about fairness, something the Tories don't understand and can't communicate, that if there is going to be a hard period ahead, the burdens must be properly shared and the biggest backs must carry the biggest burden. Fairness, redistribution, greater equality. And one of the key messages must be about fair taxation. That if there is going to be taxation, it mustn't fall on the most vulnerable people in the community. Which is why we argue that people at minimum wage level, thereabouts, whether they're workers or pensioners, should be lifted out of tax altogether. We argue you lift the threshold to about 10,000. That lifts immediately 4 million people out of income tax. and it gives a tax cut to everybody who's on low and average pay. Okay, that's a nice popular message, but we've also got to explain that you've got to pay for it. And we're quite open in saying that in a fair system, the better off have got to pay for this. And we've identified ways, practical ways, in which it can be done. And it's about closing the loopholes, the opportunities that rich people have for not paying tax. I don't want to necessarily go into all the technical details, but when you deal with people in the city, you see these abuses taking place the whole time. For example, if you're a big dealer in an investment bank, you're getting £1 million bonus, you don't pay the 40% top rate tax, let alone the 50% the government's brought in. You go along to a tax advisor and he'll convert the income into capital, so you then only need to pay capital gains tax, which is 18%. So you're paying less than the standard rate of tax on your money. And that's got to be closed. Or you could put lots of money into £1 million pension pot, and you don't just get more tax relief, you get a higher rate of tax relief. These anomalies this government have never dealt with, and we would close them and raise a lot of money by doing it and use it to cut taxes for the low paid. And I introduced the concept of a mansion tax, tax on very high value property, as another way of raising revenue that can be used in this fair, redistributive way. So that's one of the key messages about fairness, fair taxation. In difficult times, the better off people should pay more, and we should protect people on low incomes. I think a second message is that although we're operating in a very difficult time for public spending, what we will be saying is that there are key areas of public spending that not only need to be protected, but need to be increased. And we will almost certainly be arguing that in key areas like education, particularly early years education, particularly education for less privileged children, that should have priority. And there will also be help for students. We've yet to define precisely how to do that. But at a time when universities are and colleges, not just universities, are under incredible pressure, they've got to get some help. So we will try, it's my particular job, to try to ensure that where we identify savings in public spending, some of that should go positively into high priority spending, investing in the next generation. And I think we also have to give people hope that at the end of this prolonged crisis, we are investing in the next generation. One of the ideas I floated at the conference, and which we want to embellish, is the idea of having a proper bank for infrastructure. It's a weird thing about this country, that we have these sophisticated financial institutions, but it's very difficult to get any kind of money to invest in big rail projects, big renewable power projects, or for that matter roads. I know a sensitive issue in Northumberland. You know, there isn't the funding for it. You can't get stock markets to invest in it, banks won't invest in it, PFI is very costly and risky. So where does the money come from? And what we're suggesting is that we adopt a model, a bit like the European Investment Bank, and I'm sure Fiona will advise me on how best we do this. Using the European model, there are other countries too, to attract capital, underwritten by government, but to attract capital from private savers. A lot of savers, you know, putting their money into banks, and where on earth is that money going, are feeling that they can invest in something useful that gives them a steady rate of return, and institutional funding to get lots of money going into rebuilding the country, and particularly rebuilding it on environmentally sensible lines. So I think these are some of the positive ways of looking forward that we can put to people arising from this recession. So it's not all negative, it's not all austerity. There has to be a vision of how we come out of all this. I just want to make one final thought about the politics. There was a danger, certainly a couple of years ago, that with the revival of the Tories at a national level, we would be squeezed out. Hasn't happened. Hasn't happened. We're actually in a much stronger position now than we've been in comparable periods in earlier parliaments. Some people expressed anxiety about the arguments we had in the conference, and there was, you know, a certain amount of debate, and that's what the dev conferences do. We don't just treat them as rallies. But actually, we got a bigger spike in support than we've ever had in previous conferences. People knew who we were debating serious issues, and we were on the map. So our overall position at a national level is a very strong one. And I think underlying it is a sense that people have now largely given up on Labour. You know, they've had over a decade. They've made terrible mistakes with the economy, with this terribly over-centralised way of running public services that people can see is wasteful and not sensible. And there's a kind of exhaustion about them. A lot of their principles have just been abandoned. You know, the Iraq War some time ago, but people remember that. And I think above all, from my perspective, the way that Gordon Brown made this pact with the devil in his dealings with the City of London. You know, glossing over all the difficulties of being of a country over-dependent on financial services, which is what happened. Turning a blind eye to large-scale tax avoidance. It wasn't just economically suicidal, but it completely undermined the moral basis of their government. And I think there is now a sense they've had their time and they're on the way out. But at the same time, I don't think people, particularly I guess in this region, are buying into the Conservative message. And there's something phony about it, something not quite right. People have long memories, and they know that there is a certain hollowness in all this new, fluffy, touchy-feely kind of Cameron conservatism. It doesn't go very, very deep. And what we are discovering in our own areas where we have been strong, that we're actually holding the line against the Conservatives and making inroads, in fact. And there was a by-election, I don't know whether you noticed, on Thursday, not a by-election, a mayoral election in the town of Bedford, in the middle of true blue Tory territory in the south of England, which we won from the Conservatives. And this is now happening in pockets, in areas which the Tories had assumed to be theirs. That we're not just holding our ground, but we're making advances. So the prospects are good. The prospects are good. And it's in your region that we hope and expect to make some really big breakthroughs. So all party are elbow. I will be coming back here, Nick Clegg will be coming back here, because we attach importance to what you do. So thank you very much for your attention.